And now we're recording. So hey everybody, and I just recapitulated. This is Daniel Brown, Thomas Lynn. We're going to be talking tonight, probably at least for around an hour, about the question of what is democracy. Democracy, a term that everybody throws around, but few people really define. And actually, in connection with that, I'm going to bring up a quote of Thoreau's from. It's actually from the concluding paragraph of his Civil Disobedience. Go ahead and pull that up here.
Hey, Thomas, while you're doing that, I think we should go ahead and say that just as a piece of information for people who might want to join us on camera, these are some things that we might like to at some point upload onto, let's say, a YouTube channel. So if somebody has some objections, let's say, to appearing on camera, we just want to lay that out there, that this is something that eventually, somewhere down the road, one of us or all of us or somebody might want to upload this to a YouTube channel. So,
right on. Yes, thanks. It's an excellent point, Daniel. So be advised. But hey, look, here's the quote. I found it here. And I thought it was nice because it's it's actually the concluding paragraph of that famous essay of his on civil disobedience. Thoreau says, "The authority of government, even such as I am willing to submit to, for I will cheerfully obey those who know and can do better than I, and in many things, even those who neither know nor can do so well, is still an impure one. To be strictly just must have the sanction and consent of the governed. It can have no pure right over my person and property, but what I concede to it. The progress from an absolute to a limited monarchy, from a limited monarchy to a democracy, is a progress toward a true respect for the individual. Even the Chinese philosopher was wise enough to regard the individual as the basis of the empire. Is a democracy, such as we know it, the last improvement possible in government? Is it not possible to take a step further towards recognizing and organizing the rights of man? There will never be a really free and enlightened state until the state comes to recognize the individual as a higher and independent power from which all its own power and authority are derived, and treats him accordingly." And he goes on from there a few more sentences, but that's the real crux. And I think it sort of puts lots of things out there in terms of the nature of state authority and how it's going to potentially ramify for its relationship with the individual. And democracy, insofar as it's employed as a state, so the question is democracy, here Thoreau is using it as a form of state organization. But what I might put out there is that it's possible to have a democracy which is not dependent on a state apparatus, because the problematic arises when you have a state apparatus whose tyranny is theoretically mitigated by the fact that there is a majority rule, or at least representative mechanisms. You still nevertheless have a disequilibrium in power between the assertions of the state and the autonomy of the individual. And so some of it suggests that Thoreau himself in this respect has adumbrated or foreshadowed a more radical critique of democracy. Man, I'm going on, blah, 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 blah. Let me go ahead and turn it over. What are your thoughts here at the outset?
Well, it seems to me first that we need to give Thoreau his props, because it seems that when you read Civil Disobedience, it looks like that he has a personal point of view, which is, and I think it's summed up nicely when he says, the government that governs best is the government that governs least or not at all.
Right. And that's right in the outset, the beginning.
I think that's probably his preference. The way it sounds to me, the way it's couched in the essay, the way the tone of the words seems to me, that's probably his preference. So props to Thoreau right from the outset. But I think what rings throughout the whole essay, and it was just highlighted in the excerpt you read, was Thoreau's idea that kind of the kingship of every man, the sovereignty of the individual, and that's not really hammered home at every turn, but it's hinted upon, it's touched upon just about at every turn of phrase in the essay. And I think that when we speak of democracy, and you look to the early colonial Americans, their notion was kind of the same thing, that they were fighting this war for independence. The farmers and the laborers were fighting this war for independence, and they would be free. And they understood what freedom meant. We have this notion that we of the 21st century are so much more educated, and these were kind of peasants, not too quick on the uptake kinds of people, but they knew what freedom meant. They knew what it was they wanted. They knew what it was they expected. Read the writings, you read the objections to the constitutional conventions, and it's quite clear that the labor class, the working class of the colonial America, early America, wanted sovereignty of the individual. And it's so I think Thoreau touches on it here.
So, and this is like driving me to sort of almost push the conversation way fast. That's kind of like you sort of sketch some significant historical points. For one, alluding to the distinction between the Constitution with which we are presently saddled and the Articles of Confederation.
Right.
Yes, that was perhaps unduly pejorative characterization of the constitutional document. But what's important is that and I think this is not a point of terrible controversy, with the Constitution, with the assertion of federalism, you have established a strong central authority. And this authority has a kind of ambiguity about it. On one hand, it can be seen as a salutary mechanism which would prevent the ascendancy of provincial prejudices or the prejudices of localities. And oftentimes, people who want to celebrate that will point to more recently how the authority of the federal government played an integral role in civil rights struggles in the 60s and the 70s. On the other hand, it's a sword with two edges, because that same central authority can be used to advance a more generalized despotism. And to take another example from the 20th century, which has recently been recalled to us as particularly germane, you have the internment of Japanese Americans under the Roosevelt administration, finding a lamentable echo by his own account in the outlandish remark the other day of Donald Trump vis-a-vis Muslims. So this is where we come to the question of democracy. Is federalism a mode of democracy? And then there's that ambiguity we've talked about, which comes along with establishing strong central authority, and how that can potentially stand in the way of the assertion of the individual's autonomy. So, how would you reply to that sort of?
Well, I think that what you said earlier, how let me see if I can. Let me get my thought together. It seems to me that the idea that it's kind of ambiguous in that it can help mitigate or ameliorate some of the concerns of what seem to be ignored classes or underserved classes, referring, of course, to the civil rights struggle and the actions of the federal government to help ameliorate the dissatisfaction. I think that is a self-defense mechanism of the system that we've established. What I mean by that is, let's take for an example, FDR, when he instituted the New Deal programs to help to help set the country aright after its financial disasters. Just very, very generally, he didn't save the country, he saved capitalism. The system itself allowed him to do that. He saved the system. He didn't, I mean, you know, the people would not have vanished if the American financial system had to be reconstituted or reinstituted or reimagined. The people would still have been here. They had already been struggling under some great economic stress. We were still a fairly agrarian society, so it was kind of hand to mouth for many people in the country. So what I mean to say is that it seems to be kind of a disassociation, the two faces of our governmental structure. But it looks to me like on a closer inspection, it's just the more democratic aspects of our government are just safety valves to keep the power structure in check. Kind of giving carrots. Yeah.
So the question, to put the question more sharply, all right, so do you believe that the New Deal represented a genuinely democratic assertion on the part of the Roosevelt administration and the cooperating Congress at that time?
I think it was throwing. I think it was just to silence the very aggravated population that threatened to bring down the system.
So that. Okay, so I'm trying to think where I want to go from there in terms of like clarifying what is democracy, because what you sort of suggested is that is like this: that there was an energy that was manifested by people like the labor movement at the time and so forth, which reflected a popular sentiment that was troubling to the established classes in power. Mm-hmm. And the New Deal emerges as a concession to that force. But the genuine democracy of that concession itself is actually suspect, because the mechanisms whereby it was forwarded actually serve to mitigate the true expression of the popular will. Is it like that?
Yeah, I mean, let me try and clarify a little better if I could. My statements may have been a little unclear. What I'm trying to point out is the system itself, while it pays fealty to democratic traditions and language, is only democratic as far as it's necessary to preserve the system of authority. The real democratic forces, as you stated earlier, can democracy exist outside of a system of laws, governments, authorities, and so on. The real democratic pressures were exerted by and exist within the people themselves. And in order to balance that power, the state then gives concessions back to the people. So it appears that the system appears democratic, but it's only responding to threats.
All right. So what if the system isn't democratic, then what is democratic?
Well, you know, the toehold is, you know, one person, one vote. I guess that's the knee-jerk Western modern understanding of democracy. I mean, that's what it boils down to, essentially, is to run a system where everyone, pure democracy, has a say. I think we touched on this a little bit last time. In large modern states, technologically advanced states, it seems to be cumbersome, and it probably, many people say it's impossible to maintain a system like that with a country as large as this and so on. But anyway, at the end of the day, one person, one vote would be the kind of dust jacket description.
Now, I would actually offer an interesting question here. Yahawanta, I'm probably butchering your name, but hold on one second, and we will address that because I think it's worthy of consideration. But I don't know about immediately connecting democracy with a one person, one vote framework. It seems that even from the get-go, you need something which entails a little bit more engagement. You could say, okay, one person, one vote with reference to referenda, in which all issues are dealt with in that respect. I think you kind of have to put a finer grain look. I think you have to introduce additional supplementary practices. I also think the issue of scale needs to be addressed. I think that the municipality, emphasizing the municipality, and even sort of on a more particular level, the municipality as the real building block of a genuine polity could be a salutary approach there. And then you see the voting is conjoined with real conversation and real engagement, a la, the town council we kind of romanticize that a little bit, but I still think bringing it back can be helpful. And it's even, in light of technology, possible perhaps to do this in a way which transcends physical limitations. Even look at this platform here, you can see how it can be employed in that connection. So we can maybe come back to this thread, but let's go ahead and address this question put forth. I guess it was Timothy. Well, I'm not certain who asked the question. It was Timothy. Sorry, Tim. Are all societies oligarchies? Are all societies necessarily ruled by the rich? And I want to say no. What do you think? I'm willing to elaborate, but what do you think, Daniel?
I'm guessing the question is about modern societies now. Is the question about states? Is that are all? Because societies could be,
maybe what he's driving is that there does seem to be a tendency through history for power to concentrate in a few hands, and oftentimes wealth is a real index of how that power is concentrated. Sure. So you could say it could be suggested that even if at any given point you can point to this society or that society is not at this or that given point oligarchical, there may reside within that society a tendency for it to become oligarchical in virtue of perhaps a propensity of power itself to become focused in fewer and fewer hands. So in other words, to respond to the question of whether all societies are oligarchies or are fated to be oligarchies, we would have to scrutinize our understanding of power and whether power necessarily assumes an iniquitous distribution. Is that sort of where you're going with the question, Tim? You can go ahead and write in the message if you want, or are we in the ballpark of what you're trying to discern?
Society that wasn't one. Sure.
Well, I just off the top of my head, a few ideas. Actually, even though they're short-lived, there are examples. So, for example, the Paris Commune.
Spain, 1936.
And the one in the 1870s as well. And you could look at, I think that the Iroquois and certain Native American societies have a relatively equitable way of doing things. And some people say that there's a tendency toward geriocracy, right. The rule of the older as opposed to the younger.
The Israeli kibbutzim comes to mind.
There's another one. So there are examples out there. The counterpoint forthcoming is, well, did they, because they tend, or because they tend to be short-lived, or because they tend to have a utopian quality to them, there's a resistance to accepting them as like bona fide instances of non-oligarchic society. But as a matter of simple counterfactual, there's a few, and I think we could come up with some more as well. I think more importantly, I would put forth that just because it hasn't been in a stable way doesn't mean it can't be in a stable way in the future, and that's crucial. I think that we have to avoid a tendency toward a kind of fatalism if we're going to be serious about responding to the crises of our time, and the concern, and I think that maybe in connection with that, we can look at this might be an interesting. Wealth is not confined merely to the capitalist framework, obviously, right? But I'm put in mind of Slavoj Žižek's remark that it's more difficult to imagine an end of capitalism than it is to imagine the end of the world.
Yeah.
And that really is the dilemma, I think, that you put to us, Tim. And to connect it to the stated theme of the talk this evening, is democracy a part of moving forward to a world which transcends the strictures which capitalism places upon us? Daniel, what?
You bring up Slavoj Žižek, referring to it's more difficult to imagine the end of capitalism than it is for us at the end of the world. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of reasons for that. What he says is absolutely true. I think that you can ask, if you could poll, just take just a general non-scientific poll of just people in the street. They could quite easily imagine some kind of apocalyptic circumstance much easier than they could the end of capitalism. But to tie it back to our theme, I think that we have to be careful about the kind of mindset that we have when we enter into conversations like this, because it's so, for whatever reason, our countrymen, at least here in the United States, it seems, as a general rule, that we are so ingrained in this system that anything outside of it, we just simply can't form the question. We can't see. We can't even imagine that there's another way of doing things. And if there is, then it's evil or wicked or stupid or primitive, or add any pejorative you want to. That has to do with our exceptionalism, but it just also has to do with just this indoctrination that we have. Martin Luther King called it when he was referring to his opposition to the war in Vietnam, he said that we have a morbid fear of communism. Well, you can fill that blank with anything: socialism, democratic socialism, anything that doesn't have the stars and stripes attached to it. We just seem to be afraid of, or it's less than us, or so I want to invite those who are joining this conversation to try and come to this conversation with a mindset that not necessarily everything American is the greatest thing in the world. Not to say it's the worst thing in the world, but we're trying to come to some understandings of what we see around us in the world today, the difficulties of modern societies, what's causing some of the problems that we see around us today in our country. So let's try and get to some bedrock answers. And the conversation tonight is, what is democracy? And I think that we need to try and focus our minds on something other than American definitions. Just kind of a preemptive, helping us get all things together. 1 second, Thomas. I'll be right back.
Well, Daniel's going to be right back with us. So, if I'm going to take a stab at that question, which I just asked him, what does he mean by an American definition of democracy? I think that what he means is a conflation of the notion of democracy with a specific format of politics and political power, which we find in our own country, namely a federal representative republic. It's a republic. It's a representative democracy. What that means is that at the end of the day, the political power, resides with the representatives and not with the people themselves. Albeit the people elect the representatives, the decision is made by them, not by the people, as to what policies are actually going to be forwarded. And if you look at the rather distressing
Thomas, looks like you froze.
disjunction and I'm back. Sorry about that little internet hiccup. So just I pointed to how we have a representative democratic, nominally democratic government, but what this does is it dislocates the locus of power to the representatives. It's not actually made by the people, and this can be seen in the disjunction between what policies are forwarded by the American government historically and what the people historically have wanted. So insofar as that disjunction is very significant, it's really becomes problematic to characterize the American governmental system as actually democratic. The democratic system is going to have more direct engagement on the part of the people. And is this, I think, to which we need to look if we're going to move forward. So that was my effort to respond to the question, which I had put to you, Daniel. Maybe I was wrong. What do you mean by the specifically American conception of democracy, as opposed to a more universal conception of democracy?
Well, there's several things that go into it. With our representative aspect of it, you covered, but there's other things that go into our particularly American understanding of democracy. There's this conflation of capitalism with democracy and freedom. These triumvirate of words, just this word salad gets thrown around on the news, and particularly this time of year even. Our freedoms have to do with our ability to shop, which of course has to do with capitalism. Democracy and capitalism don't have to exist in the same sphere. Oftentimes they don't. China, for instance, comes to mind. They're better capitalists than we are, economically speaking. So, but for whatever reason, mass media and so on, we're indoctrinated to sometimes conflate the words capitalism and democracy.
So, why do you feel?
Well, I think it's a pure case of manufactured consent. I think it has to do with the putting down or the rising up against an increasingly socialistic. I can't even use that word, but anyway,
but we have to define it.
We have to define it.
So setting that aside for the moment, as far as possible.
Right. Let me just quickly say that there were threats to the capitalist system emerging in other parts of the world. And part of the United States' response to that was to begin to tell the American people that our freedoms were partly dependent on capitalism.
And so and what you're putting forth is simply the notion that the reason we conflate capitalism and democracy, or see them as going hand in hand, is largely a function of an established or received narrative, as opposed to a genuine structural connection between those terms. And in fact, I would go beyond that and maybe put it even more strongly than you, Daniel. I would say that capitalism as a mode of economy and democracy as a mode of genuine politics are actually an antithetical relationship.
I would agree with that.
And the reason I am going to hold that is in virtue of the case that under this framework, you have a mode of economy which drives the consolidation of production into fewer and fewer hands, and thus, by insofar as power and material capacity are often closely enjoined, though it's complicated. It's not a simple, straightforward relationship, but they're still tightly connected. Insofar as capitalism drives that process of a concentration of financial capacity and in turn of political capacity, it is at odds with a system of polity which aims to find the good for everyone. The fact is that a market framework is indifferent to the good of anyone. It is absent a moral sensibility which would be sensitive to that concern. I'm not even saying it's immoral. It's literally amoral.
Amoral, right?
And it's also a framework which encourages a high level of unconsciousness. and insofar as it does that, it sort of intensifies. It's even more intensely antithetical to genuine democracy, because genuine democracy demands a consciousness and awareness and engagement which is at odds with what is necessary for market framework to prosper, for consumerism to prosper. Now, this introduces another distinction that's between a market system and a capitalist system. And it's theoretically possible to have a market frame which isn't at the same moment a capitalist frame. The distinction is a capitalist frame is one where the production is forwarded by the market is always committed to growth.
That's right.
And that has to do with another sort of recondite distinction. It's not that recondite, but it is because of the poverty of the American political discourse between what we call use value and exchange value. So there are items. Why do you want to get a hammer? You get a hammer to pound a nail. Okay, you get food to eat. You get a house in which to live. You have a car to go places, and so on and so forth. We acquire items because we have concrete things that we want to accomplish with those items. Exchange value is driven not by a connection to whatever our concrete needs are, but the abstract notion of trade. And so then people begin to buy and sell houses, not to have people live in the houses, but to acquire exchange value, that is money. And this is an inversion of means and ends, and leads to all sorts of messes. So it seems like I've gone a little bit far afield, but I don't think I have in earnest to tie it all the way back to the origin that I think Daniel suggested, that the American conception of democracy is one that weds it to a capitalist mode of economy. But this is highly problematic as a capitalist. This is my addition and suggestion, a capitalist mode of economy is actually at odds with the genuine democratic polity. There's another issue on the table too. That's the relationship between the democracy and the state. But I'm going to be quiet.
Well, I just wanted to take it one step further, which is probably a bad idea, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway, as I want to do. As we move forward in time, from basic capitalism, we move on to corporate capitalism. It's even less democratic than what you described earlier, if it seems at all possible, because a corporation, by definition, is a perfect tyranny. It starts out with one person or group, a very small group, giving prime directives, and those orders then filter down, and nobody has any say except for those at the very top. It's a perfect tyranny. So the very engines that drive our modern conception of capitalism are themselves completely antithetical to democracy in any way.
Yes, I was just saying hello to Abdul Rahman there. Welcome. So there's this distinction, like you said, between sort of more basic meat and potatoes kind of capitalism, which we affiliate with the idea of the story of the small business and the small business.
The mom and pop, and it's always
So, and you want to distinguish that between what we call corporate capitalism or casino capitalism, or what we get from Wall Street. And now it's really a sticky wicket here, because in my view, the challenge we face is that all these problems that attend the grand corporation are actually already present embryonically in even a small business. They don't tend to weigh as oppressively upon the participants in that enterprise. And I believe the reason for that is the fact of human relationship.
Yeah, the closeness of the individuals.
And when real people are interacting in a real way, encouragingly, they find it difficult to be quite as despicable to each other. Right?
That's exactly right.
Right. Whereas, if you're just, it's the absence, it's the diminution of pathos that comes with distance. So if you're like Jack Welch or somebody like that, you are removed physically, culturally, and in so many other ways from the realities of the people under your command.
If the $25,000 job, if the $25,000 jobs, I'm about to eliminate, are an email away, versus the two jobs I'm going to eliminate are right standing in my face, there's a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So what this points to is the fact that what we really need to address is the issue of the social relationships,
right,
which undergird our capitalist framework, or whatever framework it is with which we're dealing. It's really sort of suggesting to me that we need to push it even further and ask, well, why is it that we give money so much power? Which is a big question, right? You're like, take a breath. I don't know where to go there, right? But it also adjoins the issue of democracy itself, in that if you have the idea of workplace democracy, this is something Richard Wolff. By the way, guys, this remark earlier, let me recapitulate. Sorry for the background noise on my end. I'm going to try and mute when I'm not talking. I'm in a coffee shop, and so unfortunately there's nothing I can really do to abate it beyond that. But the idea of workplace democracy and worker ownership of the firm, that seems to me to be a very encouraging way in which to lessen the injustices that we face as a result of our economic structures. Albeit, I don't think it's going to be like the ultimate solution, because even worker-owned enterprises have to participate in a marketplace which is still preponderantly driven by capitalist imperatives, i.e., imperatives of growth and competition. This can segue into the question of how do we navigate the crisis of ecology, which we have at hand in front of us. And I didn't know what thoughts might you have there, Daniel.
Well, let's first. I think what you said a moment ago reminded me of the Wobblies, where that workers should own their own means of production, and that would go a long way to lessen the blow. But as you said, everybody eventually still has to participate in the market. How that ties into and what problems those kinds of things, because at the end of the day, I think Marx kind of points it out a little bit where he says that capitalism never really solves its problems. It just moves them around geographically. And so when we look out and we watch the news and we see problems like, several months ago, Greece was about to go belly up, and Spain before that, and on and on. And we had our meltdown of 2007, 2008. The average person looks at the paper, looks at the news, and says, well, what in the world is going on? And I think that part of the importance of discussions like this is that it's a little bit relieving to know that even in the midst of all this, there's a common cause to most of the ailments that we see. And being that I think you and I agree that capitalism is antithetical to democracy, the antidote to both the economic and political systems that seem to be rife with problems is the same antidote. Is a return or perhaps a pushing forward, not return to, but a pushing forward of democracy. And as I said, I gave it kind of the dust jacket classification of one person, one vote, but we should, as you said earlier, we should go deeper and discuss what those things, what democracy might also entail. And I think you touched on them about, communities. I can't remember your exact phraseology, but it had to do with looking out for the common good, looking out for one another, and trying to better society by helping to better ourselves and better one another. Those things go down into the root, I think, of democracy as well. But I don't know how to move. I don't know how to move forward. I don't know how.
Let me just go ahead and echo the sense of again, there's a serious question on the left, well, how do we move forward? How do we instantiate these ideals, which sounds so nice, oh yes, community engagement and all the rest of it, right? And it sounds fantastic. Well, how does that actually happen? And of course, there are some immediately somewhat obvious responses, like you become more engaged with the established political structures as they stand already, right? Which means not just that you write the local representative, but that you show up at the local school council meetings, you bother those people and so forth, right? So there's that kind of political engagement, and you try and encourage your friends and neighbors to sort of join you in that process, and little things like that, right? Or if you look at where you work, insofar as possible, try and relate with each other in that space in a fashion which reflects integrity. These sorts of somewhat unexciting but transparent means are part of the solution, a big part of the solution. But I would be dishonest if I pretended like they were ultimately satisfied. It seems that there has to be something beyond that kind of quotidian, almost banal activism, and it may be that the answer to that doesn't even reside within a sphere that we typically term political. I think that, and it may not even be appropriate to use a word, but if I had to use a word, I would say that it becomes almost a crisis of spirit. And I didn't, at the beginning of this conversation, think that I would end up here, right? But if you want to ask, like, well, how are we going to respond to the violence of the world? I think a big part of it is to renounce it, to renounce that violence, and to allow that renouncement to be manifest also in how we relate with each other politically and economically.
I agree with that. I mean, how we engage, renouncing the thing. If you want to reduce violence, stop participating in it. You reduce it by half. I mean,
which you see that thing is too that we have to become more acquainted with, like, how much violence goes on in an unacknowledged way, and the wage relationship is a violent relationship. It's an exploitive, vampiric relationship, and it's damaging to both parties involved. Right?
I agree. Yeah.
And I guess the other thing that I might add in this connection is that moving forward entails, at least it seems to entail, a kind of sacrifice. And I don't mean like a material sacrifice. I don't mean austerity, but I mean we have to work together to create a different cultural environment. And that is going to translate into a friction with established ways of being. And we have to live through that friction.
I could give
different space.
I could give a couple of different examples of what you just, at least my understanding of what you just talked about. The first I'll point to, a modern example, is Occupy. The Occupy movement, one of the things that it did was that it showed the system, the governmental structure, the power structure, that it is possible to live inside the system, but not of the system, to not need the system, to a gift economy, an economy of mutual aid. And by economy, I don't just mean the exchange of goods. I mean the whole living conditions, the whole existence of these people. Their economies were based on mutual aid. And the system was threatened by this, very threatened by it. And it responded in the way that it always does to threats. It destroyed it. There was a coordinated attack against all major occupying encampments, and they were all dismantled. Interestingly enough, the first things that were taken were the libraries that these occupying encampments had built up. But the point is, here's an example to society, albeit a small one, how a system can develop and open up a space in a larger framework and exist outside of it. The second example I can point to is early Christianity inside the Roman Empire. Once again, a gift economy, basically a communistic economy. They held all things in common, if you believe the scriptures, what they write about themselves. They held all things in common. And this opened up inside a dual system. So you had the Roman Empire, the political system, the political structure. Then you had the theocratic political structure under that, but still overarching the small community of people. And they opened up for themselves a space, and they existed inside of both of these superstructures, but completely not needing them. And both of those larger structures joined together to destroy the good example, the example of the gift economy, the example of a different way of living. It's quite successfully and quite comfortably. I don't know that if I've totally disfigured what it was you're referring to, but it just brought to my mind those two examples.
No, I mean, they were, I think, pretty much on point. Just to recap, because a few people just joined us, what we've been discussing very broadly is what is the notion of democracy. Earlier in the conversation, we kind of pointed to how the American conception of democracy suffers from certain incoherencies, in that it often associates it with a capitalist mode of economy, but a capitalist mode of economy sort of corrodes the value of radical equality that presumably would be tied with a genuine democratic polity. So to establish a genuine democratic polity, it would follow from that point in the conversation we have to challenge capitalist modes of economy, which comes down to reimagining how we relate with each other socially, establishing a different cultural environment. This is where we are right now in the conversation, where it's almost a kind of spiritual shift, right? But it also would entail living through a certain friction with the established ways of being, and even perhaps, to add a further point, acknowledging that we do not live in a genuinely democratic society at this point in time. There may be glimmers upon which we can build a more hopeful possibility, but they're not really, well, they're yet to be fanned into a flame of a truly democratic world, right? And there are other questions in the background, like, what is that genuine democratic world? Because another point, and this is actually raised by Thoreau, and again, this is all by way of recap for people who just joined us, is establishing what is the relationship between democracy as a way of living in common, and democracy as a mode of state control, in which case you simply have a mitigated form of oppression. So those are some of the main moments. And then out of my last remark, Daniel points to how there are examples of communities that establish themselves within an oppressive environment and become the seeds of something which ultimately will transcend that oppression. And the examples he cited being early Christianity, which was at considerable odds both with the Roman Empire and, no, it's complicated, but the established religious structure of Judaism in its day, and more lately, Occupy. And insofar as Occupy began to establish independent spaces or encampments where, through mutual aid, another way of living was possible, it invited the intense reprisal of the established structures of state and capital. You can also think of other organizations that similarly met with such reprisals, such as the American Indian Movement, AIM, Wounded Knee. You can think of Wounded Knee, the tragedy which happened both in the 19th century, the horrible battle there, but also more lately in the 70s. Right. Actually, almost at the same time as the Watergate, you had the assertion of federal will against the native peoples there. And another example, Black Panther Party. Or, and then you can come up with lots of other ones. It's not like a historically novel development. So, all that being said, when chips are down, like how do we go from here?
Well, I'd like to consider that for a second.
Or if you want to say anything else, of course, it's open.
No, I want to consider that for a second, because we touched on this notion of one of the ways to improve the situation, maybe, or affect some kinds of change, was a more increased local involvement. And you mentioned, the unromantic tasks of going to city council meetings and things of this nature. And I agree that, what's the old hackneyed phrase? Think globally, act locally. There is some value to that, but what do you think about the notion that Chris Hedges puts forward, that the levers of democracy are so corrupted that the change within the system is completely and utterly impossible at this point? Do you agree? And if so, if you disagree, then why?
Well, I am intensely sympathetic with Chris Hedges' remark. I despair of the notion that meaningful change can be won from working within, at least on the federal level,
right?
The system, because the system has ossified imperatives that will lead people to act in it. I'm reminded of another remark of Thoreau's about the law. Let's see if I can pull it up really quickly, because it's sort of actually. Let me pull that up very quickly. It's right. But basically, I agree that the established system is not something from which we can win meaningful reform, that we have to create something anew. All right, so here is the remark of Thoreau. And he's addressing the issue of majority rule, but it is a broader context. But nevertheless, what he's saying here obtains more generally. Law never made men a whit more just.
Right.
By means of their respect for it, even the well-disposed are daily made agents of injustice. A common and natural result of an undue respect for law is that you may see a file of soldiers, colonel, captain, corporal, privates, powder monkeys, and all marching in admirable order over hill and dale to the wars against their will, aye, against their common sense and consciences, which makes it very steep marching indeed, and produce a palpitation of the heart. They have no doubt that it is a damnable business in which they are concerned. They are all peacefully inclined. It goes on from there. But it's to the point that working within the system may well simply be a cul-de-sac at best, because it involves muting our conscience in service of darkness. Okay, and war is darkness. It's dependent insanity, and so here, there we have it, right? And I see Luke, by the way, has joined us, and of course, Luke, if you want to jump in to grab that open seat, feel free to do so. And anybody else for that matter as well. I should have said that earlier. So anyway, so that's my first blush response to Hedges' remark. What do you think about that?
I read what's the book that he wrote it's like 3 books ago, The Death of the Liberal Class, Hedges' book, The Death of the Liberal Class. I read that, and it seems to me that as you pointed out, it's a bit of a doleful dirge that we have to sing when it comes to be more alliterative democracy. I I don't know at the federal level if there is much hope for it. I think that what you said earlier, again, going back to the local level, there is much that can be done in the neighborhood associations and the city council kinds of arenas, I think. But as you move further on, the corruption gets greater and greater. And I think that the levers of power are not only frozen, I think they've been removed from living rooms.
Right. I guess I just want to add a little sort of a little pet peeve of mine about the notion of corruption. And this is actually really a crucial point. We talk about the corruption of democracy or the corruption of capitalism, but oftentimes what we're identifying isn't strictly corruption, but a natural expression of the system's imperatives. So, people want to go ahead and condemn the hedge fund managers on Wall Street for their monstrous behavior. And their behavior is right in line with what they should be doing as capitalists.
Right.
So they're not actually corrupt. Right. And similarly, with established system of representative democracy that's merely representative, it's doubtful. You could argue that they are simply living in accord with the imperatives of a class society, and if we were so what this does is this produces a different question. The question is it possible to have a democratic society in which there are stratified class differences? Now
we get to it, because this brings us to Marx's concern about class societies as well, because as you point out, and I think quite correctly, or at least allude to, when we go to the voting booth, we're not voting for a person really, or a party even. We're voting for a class. Which representative of the upper class, the ruling class, would you like to oppress you? And I think that's so. The question is, as you to restate it, can there be a democratic form within class societies? And the answer, I think, probably is actually no. The answer is no. It just simply can't happen. You could have shades and shadows of democratic features, but you can't have democracy in a class system.
Right. Well, I mean, I agree. So what are you going to do about that? That's, I guess, the question. And then it comes back to the question of engaging the economic issues, because the economic framework seems to be what establishes the basis that upon which this disequilibrium of power is guaranteed.
That's right.
Right. The disequilibrium, and we're drawn back to a few moments ago in the conversation to the question of establishing new spaces within, as some people have called it, the interstices of the framework, right? In which a new, genuinely civil society, as some have called it, can be established, with Occupy being perhaps one recent example. Of course, what we encounter with Occupy is both an example of what is positive and be encouraged, and also perhaps what is challenging. And here's what I mean by that. How do we deal with the fact that, well, let me ask you what you think about this. Some people might well, Christian just asked a question. I'll get to that in one moment. Maybe she accidentally muted us. Oh, there you go. Refreshed. There you go. That's a ticket.
Excellent.
Where was I? Where was I? Oh, right. So there's like a plurality of viewpoints within Occupy that some people argue is a weakness because it created organizational difficulties that led to the liabilities related with the dissipation of its initial potency. So what are your thoughts on that critique?
I've heard it, and I think that although it was a drawback, I attended Occupy Cincinnati the opening day when the first meetings took place down at Fountain Square, and I have to say that its forms that it assumed for itself, although they appeared cumbersome, and there were multitudes of concerns and attitudes and ideas from all across the board. It was a drawback, but it was I think one of its strengths as well, because it left everybody feeling heard and encouraged and much more willing to come to consensus than let's say if they had chosen had it been some kind of smaller version of a representative situation.
Which is potentially a strength which would attend an authentic democracy. Now, this is kind of an ad hoc, well, it's not ad hoc, but I'm just going to add something in. It may not flow organically with what we've been saying, but I think it contains is relevant. I was talking with another friend of mine before our conversation, and what he put forth is that we should perhaps jettison the word democracy itself because it has already been so laden with association with, for example, all the problems that attend the American political landscape or the Western landscape, right? And perhaps imagine another mode of polity altogether. He actually thought that the notion of communism could be resuscitated to step in for that which is being held by democracy at the moment. I'm not as sanguine about that as he was, but what are your thoughts about that? You know, the notion that perhaps we need to just find a different word or different concepts.
Well, I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
What might that alternative be?
Okay, well, I think it's a great idea, but if you're going to say that democracy is so rife with misunderstandings and poisons the term itself, then certainly in the American landscape, communism would be more so, unfortunately. As far as what we would replace the term with, populism might be a good starting place to start thinking about terms. It's not perfect, but I think it would be better digested than perhaps communism.
Of course, there's a distinction which can be introduced there with reference to the question of communism. There's communism as a word, and then there's a particular mode or state of society, right, that we are presently terming communism, and we can, for the sake of an academic bracketed discussion, abstract from the issues of connotation. Yes, well, what is like a genuinely communist society, utopic in aspect, and what is the relationship it would exhibit to what we now term democracy? Or to put it yet in another way, how do we imagine political engagement? What is politics? What does it do be political. And here I am actually thinking of an additional input from Murray Bookchin. He says, like, what we have today is not politics. What we have today is statecraft, whereby the state apparatus, as a guarantor of class inequity, creates a veneer of political engagement that's actually at odds with true social reality, social being, you know. And communism perhaps represents what that reality would be, which may be in the ballpark of where we want to go. So what you could say is that we should be able to imagine a world where we no longer even have to be concerned with something like democracy as opposed to, you know, monarchy or aristocracy. And actually, this sort of almost brings us back to the beginning of the conversation with Thoreau toward the end of Civil Disobedience, remarking that the state ultimately, if it's to remain viable, has to respect the autonomy of the individual. But is it maybe the case that this ultimately condemns the state? Can a state actually afford to respect the autonomy of the individual?
No, I think at the end of it all, what we...
And I think that...
Sorry, go ahead.
I know.
Yeah.
I think at the end of it all, if we're going to go down this road, what we'll end up seeing is the dissolution of the state. I think that once the individual is respected, and I mean that politically, economically, spiritually, once the concept of the individual is respected fully, then all forms of authority are going to have to they'll be forced to justify themselves, and which will be a very hard test to do, a very hard test to pass, I believe. And since most kinds of authorities that we see are used to advance the interests of a class, they will be unable to justify themselves, and as such, they'll have to go away. But yeah, I think that in a society like that, it will disappear. The idea of statehood, state, as a congealment of authority, will disappear.
So we've been speaking in a relatively abstract way bulk of the time. Maybe we can take a few moments to relate the issues that we've been touching on. Sorry, let me take a sip here. To like events presently, right? So right off the top of my head, we can look at, let's say there are a few examples, but let's take the climate summit right now, which is like an excellent example. It's going on the UN climate summit, and it's climate summit in Paris, which really epitomizes how the engagement in these issues is so crucial. I mean, you're looking at how, in virtue of the respect that we have given state authorities, the engagement of questions of environmental and ecological health have been handed to individuals, to power brokers, who are not in any sincere way interested in resolving the ecological environmental crises. And in many ways, their existence is a predicate of their power. And so that's one level where it epitomizes it. And another level, you can see how the protests, which are occurring despite the efforts of the French government to repress them, also indicate how the force of the state is a highly problematic circumstance in connection with this issue. And of course, the state is just one level. The next level is the level of capital. And so we come to, so how do we engage the questions of ecology, environment, and so forth in light of our remarks so far? Just what are your thoughts there?
Well, what we're seeing is via the protests is a certain group of people's idea on how to engage the question of ecology and what passes for democracy in the West. They're throwing their bodies on it. They're putting themselves between a largely symbolic meeting of how much capitalist pollution and abuse of the environment we're going to endorse until this next meeting of environmental destructors occurs, versus how much we're going to try to improve the environment. But these people who are opposed to this kind of structure are throwing their bodies in the middle of it. So how do we engage it? I don't know. Because there are those of us who feel compromised by the system and have to survive within the system, who would like to be throwing their bodies on the gears, but unfortunately can't. But I think that if you ask how do we engage it, I think that's probably the only way to engage it, is to get in its way. By now, going to a polling booth and pulling a lever is ineffectual. So how do we engage it? By getting in its way.
I think that's yes. I would add to that, though, that we get in its way, and but in terms of like the environmental and ecological issue, I think we also have a real opportunity as a flashpoint upon which to consolidate other actions. So the underpinning of, and I'm thinking specifically of targeting the problems that attend big agro, where, how we get our food. Like a huge part of our dependency on the system is related to our relationship with our food. And agriculture becomes a seminal moment or point where we can reimagine that relationship in a way which undercuts our dependence on the system. And there are, multiple axes along which this can occur. I'm not just talking about like buying local, it's like you have to address it on multiple counts, right? Obviously, you want to have a relationship with local farmers that mitigates our sustenance of such monstrous organizations as Monsanto or Cargill and all the rest. But there are other things too. There's urban agriculture, radical urban agriculture, where cities organize, communities organize to start growing their own food, and things along those lines, right? And it occurs both in terms of developing an alternative way of actually getting our food, and as a space in which people could start to reimagine how they frame the world. It could become a space for radical pedagogy, to recall the great Paulo Freire. So I think that's one place where authentic democracy can actually begin to be installed in our lives in a new and vital way. Another would be like energy and our relationship with energy, which is intimately connected with a similar constellation of challenges. So actually, you're a cook, mm-hmm. Daniel, and so maybe insofar as you have that intimate relationship with food, you might add some thoughts.
Yeah, I'd say first of all that encouragingly we are seeing not just a movement towards local foods, local, buying local and keeping your dollars within the community, but we are also seeing a pretty substantial, at least as far as recent history goes, a pretty substantial increase in interest in urban agriculture. Not just in, let's say, France, where I think it was in France where all rooftops have to be, have to have some kind of green or solar panels and things like that. But also look at this grassroots, honestly and truly democratic revival in Detroit, where they're taking some of these ruined and burnt out buildings and they're creating urban gardens and urban farms even within these buildings. They're finding ways to repurpose the sacrifice zones of capitalism and create neighborhood and community-sustaining environments there. So yeah, I agree with you. It's a great place to start and exist.
It's interesting that you don't hear that much about what's going on in Detroit, which can have its own sort of symbolic power in that, you have the failure of capitalism in terms of what's happened to the car companies and so forth, right? Right there, the same space where exciting, novel possibilities are emerging and beginning to demonstrate their viability. I don't know enough myself about what's going on there, but I think that's an apt place to look.
I think,
and also look at how real democracy actually begins to live when it's no longer dependent on established structures. People are asking permission to
just
go
do it.
and occupy these abandoned buildings, and just do it. And
You're
there's something
absolutely
to that, right? Just do it. Just do it.
And I think it's interesting to look at, because not only are these communities, or they're organic, meaning they get themselves together and it's democratic, but it's also it's not only a symbolic resistance to the power structure, but it is also a very real and visceral resistance to the power structure, because these people are living in what Chris Hedges refers to as a sacrifice zone, meaning capitalism has come in, used up its resources, both labor, natural resources, and when it got too expensive to maintain their operations here in America, they offshored and left these communities to rot. So that even the basic, what we would consider the basic necessities of living in a community, banks and grocery stores and gas stations, have just pulled up stakes and gone away. And these people have had not only the courage, but the dignity to get themselves together and find a different way to move forward. This is real resistance. This is real resistance. And I think we should have a look at it and look more closely at it. I think you're right. It's worth us further investigation.
Yes, maybe we can look into talking with somebody from Detroit in the future, someone who's on the ground there. And by the way, thanks, Kristen. Acknowledge the conversation here in a gracious way. I appreciate that. Thank you for listening. Thanks to everybody for listening to our efforts here. That being said, we're actually coming up on time here. So we should probably wrap it up a bit, obviously, to come back. And maybe we can come back to Detroit, what's happening in Detroit. Not just in Detroit. I'm sure we can find similar examples around the world. Maybe we can, where a new and vital community is emerging and constructing itself without relying on established structures. And maybe this is, in fact, the way forward. So we'll look into that for the lab here down the road. So let's go ahead and wrap it up here. Daniel, do you have any concluding remarks?
Yeah, sure. First of all, Thomas, thanks again for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and I'm always humbled listening to you, and I always learn so much. So it's a great pleasure to be here and be able to have this dialogue with you. And I just want to encourage folks who might be listening and remind myself as well that what we see around us is the result of a series of decisions that have been made with our consent, without our consent. But nevertheless, these current system, the current situation we find ourselves in economically and politically, are merely the result of decisions made by men and women. And we can choose to unmake those decisions. These aren't laws of the universe. They're just laws made by men and women, and we can unchoose them. So I want to encourage everybody listening to hold tight, hold fast, and remember solidarity and democracy now and solidarity forever.
That's right. Past is not the future, my friend. And I think I will. I don't think I will leave you with that. That's the last word for this evening. Unchoose, right? So yes. Excellent. All right, so I think we'll be getting out of here. So thanks again to everybody. Thank you, Kristen, and
Thanks, everybody.
Luke, and everybody watching. And we'll come up with something here in the next week or so as well.
Okay,
right.
great.
See you guys on the flip side. Have a
See you
lovely
later.
evening, Daniel.
Take care. Thanks, Thomas.
Ciao.